Welcome back to the Lumbertron podcast. I'm your host, Tyler Woods. I am just wonderfully excited to introduce today's guest, an old friend, recently reconnected, Derek Hearwolf Tendersong Washington. Beautiful soul with a gregarious heart. We riff on some heavy stuff and really have a great chat, talking about regenerative intimacy, social permaculture. It's a real journalism of the soul. Some of it makes sense, some of it might not make sense, but it was really beautiful, and I hope it can inspire you to embiggen, enlarge, and embolden your own love and your own dreams. So, take a deep breath, and let's dive into it.
Well, what marvelous maverick aliveness that's showing up in your life and mine. What might we dabble into today?
What might we dabble into today? That is a great question. Welcome to the Lumbertron podcast, the best storytelling podcast that no one's ever heard. And I'm so pleased. I'm so pleased to share this space with you. That's the space where so many have come before to the simple question of just, who are you? Who are you, Derek Tendersong?
Wow. I am somebody experiencing the continued advances of a love affair that I did not know existed until just recently. In the last couple of years of myself pursuing myself and love with me in ways that I never have. And as luscious and as dreamy as that feels and might sound, it's most recently involved reeling in a leash of a part of me or pieces of me that I have exiled and has been apart, and I've treated as ugly and as unwanted. And if I could keep them hidden behind the curtain, maybe unseen by the world too. And lo and behold, some of those critters have gotten out and they get seen more than I think they do. And loving that and falling in love with me and realizing this place of an integrating masculine and feminine for me, finding a community of welcoming my deep masculine that I love, my nurturing feminine that I so love, my surrendering and receptive feminine that I so love and kept hidden for so long that and the lovemaking that is happening within myself is bringing a sense of belonging and community that I just didn't know before. And that's who's showing up, a part of who's showing up right now with you.
Yummy. That's wonderful. So this sense of communal, divine, internal, external lovemaking that you're experiencing right now, you say is different from before. Let's dive into that before. What are some of the ways you showed up in the world before? What are some of those things that you kept hidden? The things that you didn't want running around in the world?
Yeah. Robert Bly talks about that when we're young, we're given a little black bag to carry around, and it's small enough when we're young that we can put everything that we don't like or that we're afraid of, and we can put it in that little black bag and keep it nice and tidy. But as we age, it then gets fuller and fuller. And, I can like imagine a Santa Claus, with this giant bag for the world, on his back. And he says it gets so big that it's like, when we're walking around the corners and going through elevators, it gets caught in the door, with all these things that we're afraid of. And, uh, there I was raised in an environment, and my traumas taught me, and the meaning I took from experiences that I call trauma, the poor meaning that I have taken, taught me um to abhor things that there was shame in those things. And so I began abhorring them and keeping them secret, and my family didn't appreciate them, certainly. And um yeah, things that were less than perfect, things that were, I don't know, I guess shameful according to the moral code and the ethics of the day I was raised. And, some of my background is that I was an Episcopal priest for 20 some odd years and stayed within a system that found me very young and that taught me and initiated me, and my family couldn't and didn't. When my own father didn't know how to initiate me, nor did his father. The church gave me certain ways to be initiated, and
Mhm.
I went into that system and found a way. And then in the midst of that loving, I learned that there was, even in the midst of desires for living unconditional love within that system, there was a lot of conditionality. And I learned, that's where I started, I think, really learning some of this shadow stuff and stuff that wasn't acceptable and that might not be pleasing. Certainly wasn't pleasing to them, and therefore their understanding of God. And that's a whole nother story of my devotion to this divine thing that I love now and that I tend the sacred of now.
Yeah. So you really growing up with these shadow parts of yourself that you didn't like and feeling shameful around, you found a way to be initiated in a world of divinity in a way, but it had a conditionality to the love. And so
Mm.
when you saw those conditions, how did you how did your true self feel about that? Looking for
Mm.
unconditional love,
Mm.
what did you run up against?
Mm. Lovely question. Um, I ran up against, in my era of the 70s and 80s when this was being formed in me. I was born in 60, so the late 60s, 70s, of mm, that life could be more closer to perfect. And the faith of the day that I kind of got into in a conservative movement was, if you just had enough faith, if you just kept the rules enough, if you knew enough of those scriptures, it would change you in ways that would purify you, and all shadow would be gone. And and in fact, if you still had the shadows, you probably weren't doing something right. And so it was almost it was a spiritual abuse for me,
Mm.
of tending like, you're just not getting it right. And um, there's elements of sensuality and sexuality in there. And that one is important for me today, as equally important as the elements of grief and anger and even fear, these core emotions. Um, Anger was one that was shadowed in my family and only explosively engaged. And the way my inherited religion said there's a certain way to address that, and they actually didn't really address anger very much.
Mm.
So that's a shadow for me, is learning to welcome anger and to deal with it, be initiated into it with my grief. And yeah, so I'll let that go for now and see if that lands with you.
Yeah, yeah. So just feeling the core feelings, the things outside of glad and happy, the dark feelings, grief, sadness, and the ways that you were able to be invited to feel those feelings were they 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 were conditional. They were another thing to throw in the black bag and not look at.
Hmm. Yeah. And this whole element of sexuality and sensuality for me, which I am wired for connection, I am wired for intimacy. And it's not just a wiring that I acknowledge and own within myself. I honor it and see it as something actually beyond me, that I care about surviving beyond what my needs or my desires or passions are. I
Mm.
desire to see an expansion of our deep hearts desires met in this world with a label, a blessing of holiness on it and sacredness, and the journey to get from passion and longing to express desire. And how can that be holy, uh, especially when I was taught that there was no virtue in some of the ways I wanted to express myself, some of the desires I had, and my love for the male form and for the masculine, and to also love my own masculine, and to watch a world coming to grips with from the 60s and 70s of the free love movement, and the whole movement for homosexual love to be brought into the mainstream into the 80s, and then watch the AIDS movement come, and the moral system judge and the religious system hammer. um, it had an imprint on me. And as a young one who found the church as a sanctuary out of the violence of my own home and out of the unrest there, needing sanctuary, needing a covering so I could be safe, physically even, and finding a nurture in that environment, then watching that whole religious system turn violent in its own way, and unwilling to claim the shadow of its violence by doing great harm to many people by, I guess the definition of spiritual abuse I will use is claiming that there will be punishment in this life and in the next by a God we cannot prove, by not attending to the ways we say that God is. Um, to me, that's spiritual abuse. And I started seeing that and trying to come up with my own answer of how do I get out of this. Um, would I displease this very God that I say I love, this divinity, this source that I couldn't phrase in those terms back in the day? I had to call it in the patriarchal understandings of that faith that was given to me, and how I might bring that forward. I just knew that it needed to stop. The abuses that I saw happening needed to stop, and I thought there was more virtue to be had than what they were saying was possible. And there's something about that. I don't know where that came from in me. I think it's the collective outside. I think I was listening to our Sacred Mother dreaming what I call the divine feminine, this beautiful earth, the cosmos, the divine feminine. I feel and hear her singing something different. And yeah.
So those different messages that you got from the earth itself or the collective, whatever, that feeling outside of yourself and the church and the institutions, how did that pull you? How did that show up for you between what you knew and what you felt outside of that? Did that show up as a
Mm,
tension? Did that manifest in relationships with the institutions, with others, with yourself? It's
mm,
almost like a call to action in the hero's journey. How did that
mm,
show up for you?
mm-hmm. Oh, mm, lovely questions again. I love rehearsing and remembering. I had a passion for men as much as I did women, and because of my childhood was had such traumas in it and violence, and a lot of broken homes and broken marriages between my parents. I waited a long time to get married, and I didn't want to pursue intimacy. I didn't think I could do it very well. And I had a desire for both men and women in my 20s, but it was not approved of to have any desires for men. So I followed a track of marrying a beautiful woman. And I had a best friend within the church who came out as being gay. And I was like, I didn't know what to do with this. And he and I were both taught in earlier days that this wasn't right and we were going to displease
Mm.
God. And so I had to walk for several years of what do I do with this tension? I loved him so much, my best friend in the world. And I went into seminary. I had gotten married, started having children, and and then I had my own desires, my own fantasies as I made love to my wife and as I took care of my own sexual needs. Um, but yet thinking I was displeasing God the whole time. And so living with a great tension that because I realized I loved my best friend so much and that what he was doing, I just finally said, I don't know if you allow cussing, so get ready to do bleeps on this. Would you prefer me to not? I said, fuck this. You know, if this God that I say I love is going to treat folks like that, what they say that God will, that he will, then I don't want anything to do with that God. And I had to come to Jesus moment with that God. And pun intended. And I just said, you know, if that's the way you are, I don't want to spend eternity with you. And my whole life to that point was basically a little bit about now, but mostly about what was to come.
Mhm.
So it called me out of presence. It called me out of embodiment. And there was going to be rewards to come to follow that moral code, to follow that system. And that was going to be much more precious than what we're living in now. My first wife died shortly after we were married, and my youngest child was born just after he was born. And I had three little ones to care for. And this moved into a period of time where I was looking at my own identity. My masculine was still present. My feminine nurture for my children was present, and that was rising up. And then I married again as I went to seminary to become an Episcopal priest. And I married within the same religious system. And I talked with my wife about some of my struggles about this desires for masculine love as well as feminine. But we both had an understanding that if I was honest and vulnerable enough with this God about all of this in my confession, then that God would heal me of these things. And it turned out to me to actually be more of a slow death than a healing. And I remained in that marriage for 24 years, just got divorced 2 years ago. And I remember as I moved out of that story of an elder in the church, I became a hospice counselor because I couldn't do the faith supremacy thing that came with that story, and then the resulting moral superiority that came out of that faith supremacy. I just couldn't do it anymore. So I saw where the spiritual abuse was causing people to be afraid to die. And I thought, holy fuck, I can't be a part of this system anymore. And they're not calling that spiritual abuse. Holy fuck. So I was doing my own awakening. I'm a white male. I'm 61 right now as I speak. And I just was in my own fragility, in my own ignorance, yet I just couldn't take that anymore. And I cared about people too much. And I started discovering that it was important to me to not have people die afraid. And my life started taking on a different tack that also led to not just being afraid to die, but being so afraid to die that we really never live in this life.
Mm. Yeah. So being with people in hospice really helped you realize like the true importance of living the presence and not being so invested in a future that may or may not exist. And so for yourself, was that kind of the like the straw that broke the camel's back into this change of where you are now, or was that a gradual process of like evolution, or
Hmm.
what took you away from the church ultimately?
Hmm. That somewhere something within me rose up and said, if this is the way it is, I don't want it. I don't know where that courage came from, but there was
Mm,
a number of questions that I started asking in 2008. I remember starting to ask the truer questions. And for me, questions that had no right to go away, as David White would say, questions that have no right to go away. I started asking those questions, and it took about 4 or 5 years, but my questions were not welcome in the church settings that I was in. And I was found by a bishop who liked actually the questions I was asking, but it was not really in charge of the area I was in. In that interesting way, things like that happen. And he and another group of clergy helped me start a new community, a new way of being based on an old Celtic model. And I was starting to be drawn by my Celtic heritage. I'm a Washington of the Washington line, and I go all the way back into England, into Scotland and Ireland, their roots there. And so I was interested in that way. And this bishop had written a book, and it had this. He said that the Roman model that came into the church was you believe and then you behave. You believe correctly, you behave correctly, then you can belong. That is a model that kind of got really strong around 600 AD, give or take 100 or 200 years either side of that. But the Celts really opposed this strongly for a number of years. And actually, they were able to hold out even till now. The Celtic brand of Christianity that has allowed for the pagan way, the divine feminine to still be present in such mystery.
mm,
Um, it's still there. There's a lot of conservative elements in Christianity in that area of the world, but there's an interesting weaving as well. And this Celtic understanding was no, you belong, and and then because of your belonging, your behavior may change and you may come alive. And if this aliveness tends to you, I'm reading in a little bit more here, but this is how I would see it flow. You belong first, and then your behavior will change because of the affection there, the love. And then you may choose to believe what we're believing if you say, why is this happening? And so it was a whole different form of evangelism, if you will. It
mm.
was a wooing, more of a nurturing towards, instead of a hammer down. I saw that and I wanted that, and I started a community in Wisconsin based on that, still under the auspice of the church. And that bishop and a couple of clergy took me into the woods and consecrated me as a bishop, not in any pomp, not in any circumstances. And I would probably be disowned by any of them that said it, because I was removed by the next bishop as a heretic. So, but this event still happened for me. And they said, we see what you're doing. We see your heart in the world. And we consecrate you as a bishop of the heart. And um, the questions I was asking, it even seemed that my my relationship with my wife, I felt tension even there, and I felt my own sensuality and things still alive in ways that wasn't blessed by that former moral code that I was under. And as I ventured further away from the church, the relationship I felt, for me, the relationship with my wife kind of went like this. And that opened up a space, a continued space. And that's when I began my hospice work. I went into a deep depression actually in 2014. I realized that this was untenable, something needed to change, and I did not know how to change it. Massive depression and massive anxiety for 6 months. Um, and somehow in coming out of that, I discovered psilocybin, and in that time, with some of the people that I started this new community with, my eyes got open to different ways of thinking and being in the world, to Celtic shamanism, I'm sorry, that too, but a Peruvian shamanism and a Peruvian cosmology that caused my heart to just awaken. And I realized I believed some very deep and difficult things for a long time, and I was closed. And now, if I believed it was an error in myself, and I needed that to open, and it was opening. And I thought, I'm going to just open up, and if I'm going to err, I'm going to err on the other side, and just allow my heart to be softened and believe in this beautiful divine feminine and in the cosmos. And I probably started a number of things there, but maybe that answers the question a little bit. Gets the juices going.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like you're really invited into a belonging first method of being, still under the church, being in that space of like, oh wow, this really speaks to my soul. And as your like world grew and you found these new things, open to new ideas, plant medicines, shamanism, began to really nurture you and the divine connection to like just your own belonging in the world. So yeah, going forward from that, how like were you still connected to the church? Did you want to leave to the church? What were you looking for? Did you seek
Mm.
truth? uh
Mm.
Everything's blown wide open. What do you know? What do you want to know?
Mm. Yeah, deep seeker of truth, of the operating manual for life, and the ethics that I wanted to live, the morals that I wanted to live, was not working anymore. And then I got introduced to poets. I got introduced to David White. I got introduced to Rumi and Hafiz, and Daniel Ladinsky's translations of that, particularly, and Coleman Barks's translations, and some of Robert Bly's. And that started opening my heart, and Rilke's poetry, and it was a beautiful way to ask questions, to let poetry for me is like the journalism of the soul, and
Mhm.
it's where questions are welcome. And I as I started asking those questions, I then started asking questions about my own sensuality and sexuality, because I'm a very sensual being. And the things that I was told was wrong, I started questioning. I started questioning the virtue of sensuality and sexuality beyond monogamy and celibacy that I had made hundreds of couples and counseled hundreds of couples, and had only offered limited ways to view the world, and to view these relationships. And it came with the baggage that if you didn't stay together, you displeased God somehow, and therefore shame or spiritual abuse came into the picture once again. And to me, that was so anemic, to just offer that, those offerings at the table, the buffet that I believe that we're offered in our life. And I started asking my own questions of, um, yeah, like I said, I was removed from the ministry in the church as I had known it. It was the most painful thing that ever happened to me up to that point. Aside from I don't know, it was pretty close to being my first wife's death, who I loved very much, precious to me. Yet the church had nurtured me as a parent and had initiated me. And when then I was booted out, so deeply painful. And as I look back on it now, probably one of the greatest things that could have ever happened to me. I did not know how to get out, and I think that's probably why my depression came. I just didn't see the escape hatch, and I became an opportunity in my rural town to not only be the hospice counselor, but a Unitarian minister. So I started doing that with a broadened perspective of awareness and what was acceptable in sensuality and sexuality. And even then, in 2018, 2017, 2018, I realized in the area I was in of the Midwest, it was still, I'm guessing, intuitively saying 70% Catholic and Lutheran combined, maybe 80%, and very conservative values. And so even people that said they wanted a liberal spirituality, when it came to the deathbed, people were concerned about believing correctly so they would go to heaven. Still in that environment. And I brought light there, and I started writing. I was a composer for spiritual music and praise music back in the day. I started writing music to console the dying and the living, and acceptance and belonging and love bigger than what we may have known before. And in the doing of all of that, I realized that was suffocating me, to go in and continuing to face people so afraid to die, and to try to bring in peacefulness. And the way the hospice world is moving today, it used to be you would catch people 1 to 4 months when they get a diagnosis, that you would have with them as a spiritual counselor. Then you would have time to do the existential questions more and more and more and more, because of the allopathic system of medicine today in our culture, driven by, I would say, a patriarchal system that lost the matriarchal care of a nurturing thing of healthcare. Boy, when it has come to filling beds as opposed to healing the soul and the body, we miss something. And what was happening, and I think it's still the trend today, is we were getting people with 1 to 4 days left to live, because they were pushing this whole system of being afraid to die. Well, let's do everything we can to keep you alive, because death is seen as some kind of failure. Then everything squeezed down to just a couple of days with people, and it's hard to do much there. And that, I was just thinking, I think there's a better way, and maybe I can be a part of rewriting a moral code and a way of being where we can be more glad to be alive. And I was sharing with you the other day, this area for me in regenerative culture, regenerative community, I hear a lot about that, and I don't know exactly what the word means. As I listen to people like Daniel Christian Wall and Analu Smitzman, I get inspired what regenerativity means. For me, as I watch regenerative agriculture, regenerative real estate, regenerative economy, it's like, what are the principles of regenerativity? For me, I see regenerative intimacy to be so key to us coming alive. To me, that's where life loves being lived by those loving to live life, and we can be glad that we are alive. And that's probably where I'm driven today. That's what I'm devoted, not probably, fuck that. I'm driven and motivated by that today. And I'm willing to reel in my shadows, my own longing, my own sense of adventure and fear in this whole terrain of sacred sensuality and sacred sexuality. And this is where you find me, and where we had such a beautiful conversation the other day.
Yeah. Wow. That's huge. It's almost as if when you discovered that Celtic model of belonging first, your travels have helped you see like what to place first. That word regeneration to like I feel like I need to define it right in front of myself, but like to constantly make anew, renew, and build, to apply that to intimacy, to connection, relationships. I see that as kind of like your focus going forward. And like, where does that even begin? How do you see that showing up in any small way, in small part? Big picture, small picture. What does it feel like?
Well, it has shown up for me in my poetry and my writing, my speaking, and my music. I've written some very deep, sacred, sensual poetry that's using imagery and metaphors from what I was raised in and my inherited faith, but expanding that to define it maybe more expansively into more virtuous ways that make my heart happy. I got exposed to permaculture and permaculture ideals and principles back when I came out in 2018, when I left the Midwest and came out to the Pacific Northwest. And people started talking about this and listening to the land and listening to the earth. And I was believing that there's something we're missing as we spend so much time simply trying to heal from our traumas. We don't have time to listen to the earth. And I started turning my attention to listening there. People were talking about sustainability. And I thought, this is lovely, yet I think there's more. People started talking about social permaculture and these ideas of how can we listen to each other and to community, living in community in ways that, in similar ways that like we're listening to the land. Are there principles that we can come up with and practices that will help us want to not just live in closer proximity, but want to love each other more deeply, love each other even beyond the moral constrictions of monogamy. It can there be other seats at the table where we can express lovership to more than one person? How can we be more related, even if we are just monogamous? How can we be more related and connected to each other in intimate ways that make us glad to be alive, that make loving together beautiful and something worth waking up for, that makes us able to, causes us to desire to want to go through the hardship together, and then also then will even want us to die together? That the community I started in Wisconsin was called the Anam Cara community. And it was based on this soul friendship that came through the Celtic world. I don't know when exactly it started, but it was this idea of soul friend, Anam Cara. And it became this idea that you would make a commitment to your friends, that life was short in those days. Sometimes it was long, but often, the blue-faced people would come over the hills, and you were taken, or, disease came, or it ended quickly. And we didn't know if we would see each other at the end of the day. And so they made commitments that I would be your Anam Cara and you would be mine. And I would midwife you. If you were sick and were dying, I would care for you. And you would care for me, whoever it came first to. This was beautiful idea. And it came, and in around 1000 AD, the Arabs and the Jews and the Christians formed a pocket in Spain, I think up in near the Pyrenees Mountains. And I forget the exact location, but around 1000 AD to 1491, 1492, if that date rings a bell, it's intentional. A thriving place called the Art of Dying thrived. The greatest medical that we know of in that time, through the Dark Ages, bringing all these religions and cultures together. That, as my understanding, King Ferdinand or whoever it was that once they started explorations into more colonizations, they exerted their power and tore this place down, and persecuted the people that brought these three cultures together. All of that to say, this Anam Cara way of openness, of acceptance, of honoring each other's deep truths without forcing our truths on each other, and then saying, I will die with you, and I'd be honored to have you die with me. And regenerativity to me incorporates that whole cycle of not just a bunch of 28 to 35-year-olds saying, let's do something different. That's a beautiful thing. But incorporating our generations, my generation and older, saying, I don't want to fucking tiptoe quietly to a safe death, though my proclivity is probably to do this, everything that has been hammered in here through my culture. And now I'm afraid, what's happening to my investments? What's happening to, am I going to have health care as I age? Am I going to have relationships, et cetera, et cetera? How do we take the gravitas of all of that and say, is there something more beautiful that we can give back? I mean, this is the eldership that I feel called to, that we can give back. And I was a missionary for years in the church, and now I see myself as a permissionary, a giver of blessing to ways that are more expansive, that just might make the heart glad to be alive. Yeah.
Thank you. I really hear, I hear eons of flavor just wrapped up in this story of like discovering an old way of putting people first, of listening, of celebrating everyone's everything, and still having that bond of just like, I'm there for you. I will die for you. We are good together no matter how we think. There's no way to be right because everyone is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that
Living
blessing.
from a power that is from within as opposed to a power over, which is something we're all trying to work through, I think. And I love Starhawk's talking about this in her book about the darkness, power from within. That, to me, sharing that helps us be together to where we won't be violent towards one another, and we won't put our truth over onto somebody else, allowing us to do what you just said.
Yeah. And so the space that you're in now, I hear that you are like in a place of that elder energy, spreading that blessing of that own internal guruship. This is like that everyone has, of that, like, it's not, the haves and the haves not. It's just really celebrating everyone's internal landscape, their truth, their beliefs, and how can you give back and celebrate in a new way.
Yeah. I was listening to East Forest either last night or this morning, probably last night, cooking dinner, and Ram Dass was on there, and I love that album of East Forest with Ram Dass, and he was saying some of those very things. And I love this idea of the universal self. I wouldn't force this on anybody, but this idea of a universal self that's beyond the ego self, and an essential self, actually, that where our soul may reside, if I can still use terms like that. And right now I'm comfortable still doing that. I was reading something by Barbara Marx Hubbard. It's called 52 Codes of the Self-Conscious, of Consciousness. That's not the exact title, but one of them says our first energies, our first love affair is for the ego and the essence to fall in love, to believe that we're more than just this and what has happened to us, than this egoic self, that there's more. And so we broaden out to this essential self, that there is more, what I would call the soul, the energy, the essence of us. And she says the second love affair is from the essence to the universal self, where we really see ourselves as connected to the divine, as a part of the collective, as a part of source. And then living into that, believing that there is a connection in the present to who we are now in this physical incarnate breath, to who we were before, what was holding us before we came here, what will hold us when we leave here. And I love this thought. And I love Zach Stein's questions. He's one of my teachers. Zach Stein's questions of, of what if beauty was the preeminent thing in the universe, not light, not this Greek duality kind of thing of light and versus darkness and love versus, but what if it's beauty? Everything else results from that. I was so moved thinking from that universal place of the purpose of maybe the unity of beauty, then the duality of beauty finding longing, having affection for itself, beauty knowing beauty, and beauty having affection for itself, longing is born. And from that union, light comes to see the object of its affection. And this trinity of our becoming in all of this, our expression of beauty's becoming, a trinity is formed. And to me, this is a part of each of our fractal of who we are as community, whether we call that our masculine or feminine, but beauty and longing coming together and moving from that egoic place through the essential into the universal. I'm seeing a way to dance with the quantum of that place where potential still is and possibility remains, and where divinity is rediscovering itself and becoming available once again as resource and source for generativity and regenerativity, for generosity and regenerosity to happen. And we stumble into that. And I've begun some healing practices within this of going into Jean Houston and Anna Lou Smitsman are some of my teachers right now. And Anna Lou is one of my coaches. And I was participating with a beloved who had a very rough diagnosis to deal with. And I started applying some quantum principles of healing through my voice and singing into her, and transmuting from that place of the cosmic tree beyond ego, beyond essence, into that universal place where the all is, and everything is happening and available now beyond time. And I get this idea that life is more than living, and that there is more than just our aliveness now. There's more than our death. There's more. And if we can tap into that place, and for me, I started singing, using my voice, because singing is a part of me, singing my voice, and with intention changing those, my instructions were, and what made sense to me was to transmute those cancer cells into stem cells from that place of potential. And I did. And the result has been beautiful, and for me, very startling. There's no cancer present at this time, from where we had been told much cancer was present. So this is living itself out in me in new ways of healing expression, and in this whole area of regenerative intimacy, it's living out in ways of blessing and forging my own way and my own sensual sexual expression in the world. I shared with you this kind of opus call of brothers loving brothers in deep and intimate ways, even sexually, beyond the beauty of platonic love, but not even necessarily involving the sexual, not even involving romance necessarily, but the beauty of sacred, sensual, even sexual love together, believing that through our joy and pleasure and aliveness that can come from that virtue, that the world will respond, the earth will respond to our aliveness and our joy. It will continue to help heal our traumas. Then we can listen to this earth and listen to each other's need for healing, and maybe speak from a new place.
Yeah, it's like the act of finding your voice is like I'm thinking of doing like a thumper vibrating into the ground, like inviting the earth to witness your own self-realization above trauma, above triggers, outside of shadow. Yeah.
I'm curious from you.
Hmm.
What's it like to hear all of this from me, from a 61-year-old who's making a journey like this? What's it like to hear this?
It's interesting to try to like watch my brain go to like duality or like things I've heard of or things that exist, like to find words to make this make sense into whatever worldview I have or I try to have. Uh, it's really fun. And like, the concept of regenerative intimacy, I was like, okay, what does this really mean? But I'm starting to get an image in my head of like, you used the phrase like witnessing itself a few times, and I got this image of just like light or lasers bouncing off of a hall of mirrors, just going off in every direction, coming back on itself, crossing through all of these things. And that's kind of like, that's like that second level of the love affair that you talked about. It's like the first one of just going outside of ego. Love being admitting that there's another person outside of myself, to that level two of admitting there's a universe of divine possibility outside of this human thing. And in that possibility of all the lasers connecting and rediscovering itself, that's like where that regenerativity comes from. It's just like everything discovering itself in this weird Ouroboros of no beginning, no end. And so it's really, I can just pick up on the passion and the lived experience and the excitement, and really appreciate for all that you bring, all that you've seen, all that you understand and want to understand, without trying to fix anything, without trying to preach or convert or just like, this is the way. It's really just like, I hear what you're trying to put first, hear what has been powerful for you, hear where you're growing. And it's rad.
Hmm. Hmm.
So thank you for the invitation to bring my own witnessing of this into the conversation.
Yeah, I'm curious. I still am, of how you integrate who you're becoming. And are these thoughts refreshing? Are they needed in the world today? I'd love to hear from you.
Are they needed in the world today? I do believe so. Just as you even talked about a society in which, dying is a failure, people are treated as less than people and just kind of commoditized in a culture that's just like going and doing, and really exists just kind of like in the narrow bandwidth of playing it small, playing it very human. And these concepts, this bigness and richness of the universe is like, it's the thread that ties humanity together, going back however many thousands of years. It's the thread that ties in with shamanism, with pre-religion, with like ancient knowledge and the way things truly are. And it's just like forgotten about or pushed aside by the kind of conquering, the colonialism, the I am better than, I know best, I own things way that the world has turned. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for.
And that's just one humble bear's opinion.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. May I ask, Tyler, how old you are
I am 32
at this
at
recording?
this
You are
first recording.
32 at this recording. Yeah. I value your just attuneness to these things, and um, it was a warmth to feel in the conversation with you. I love how the generations can find places of connecting and value that. And I'm mindful too of, I recall hearing a study that a brilliant nurse did, a hospice nurse, that palliative care nurse, that the number one regret of the dying is they did not have courage to live as their truest self. Their number one regret, that they didn't have courage to live as their truest self. And as a priest, one of the things, and a hospice counselor, I would hear confessions on the deathbed. And so often it was secreted love, secret intimacy that was not allowed in the systems that were. And then people didn't have the courage to reach for what they desired or to even name it. And this has become something very important for me, and for us to learn how to be honorable in owning our desires. And really, I'm finding the way that I own my desires mostly more truly is when I own my shadow as well, and own my fear of what the consequence of my desire might be in the world, and still let it come out and be shared. So I've been spending time preparing some writing and thoughts in my mind of how to bring a new morality, be part of the manual, the new operating manual for a new paradigm that's coming, of how to live and love and be, and to allow people to be more fully alive as they live, and more fully alive as their truest selves, and not be afraid of this. And I told you one of my favorite poets was Hafiz, and I love this line that he has that addresses this for me. He says, "One regret, dear world, I'm determined not to have when I'm lying on my deathbed is that I did not kiss you enough. One regret, dear world, I'm determined not to have when I am lying on my deathbed is that I did not kiss you enough." For me, the metric changed from win-lose on this whole success thing. My generations have said is this is how we determine whether we've had a good life, of whether we were successful or not. It's not the metrics that I was told. To me, the metrics are, were my fucking lips wet when I died? Are my lips wet now? And am I risking? And is there courageous vulnerability somewhere in my life right now to where I'm risking for the kisses that I know I'm made for? And I mean that metaphorically, but it also for me and maybe others, if we're talking about regenerative intimacy that goes into sacred sexuality and sensuality, it may be real kisses too. And I've been risking some of those in my life too. Lovely. But the truth is, the kisses we are made for generally come from deep within our being, and they're from our own generative places. And this is where generativity comes in, and the regenerative cycle of life being more than sustainability, but thrivability, to where we are glad to be alive, and that we measure our lives by the wetness of our lips, being ready for the kisses that we want to reach for, that we are reaching for. I want you to reach for the kisses you're made for. whether that's the dreams you have that are percolating deep in, Tyler, and I don't know what magic you feel you have for the world, but I know it's there. I sensed it when I first met you. um, I want you and everyone listening, and all those who know me when they're around me, to experience that they are beautiful and holy, and that they can risk the intimacies that they long for. I wish that for you.
It's a mic drop moment right there. A courageous vulnerability, I feel like, is the pillar of this whole idea of the regenerative intimacy. Just starting with self, starting with true self, starting with owning my desires, and really redefining the whole metric of like, what is a good life? What is real social currency of love, connection, and wealthiness of spirit, wealthiness of community. Shifting from ownership of stuff, of ownership of lands, to owning my shit, to owning my shadow, owning my gold. And that's
Owning our grief, right?
owning the grief, owning the feelings,
Owning our grief, which leads us to both shadow and love, and desire, because we generally only grieve the things that we truly love. And when there's been no expression for that, and when we've been told that the things that we most deeply love are shameful or aren't welcome, that's another contributing factor, I think, to being unable to grieve today, is because some of the things we want to grieve have not been allowed in our culture. And why I want to say, I want to rewrite the fucking manual, or be a part. I want to be one of the contributors to that. And that's what I hope my life is. Yeah.
Is page one of the manual just a mirror? You just open it up and it's look at yourself and it's like, whoa.
Yeah, one of the contributors, one of the authors, you open it up and there it is, it's a mirror. And say, yes, you welcome to write, and I think it's true that we aren't just victims in a story or participants in a story. I think my religion would have, my former religion, my inherited religion, would have us say that we're just kind of pawns in a story, and that all this is, there's a blueprint that we have to follow, et cetera, et cetera. But no, today I am believing more and more that we are storytellers, yes, story writers. We are story writers. And this is what our life has been given. I think in this sacred universe, picture, if you will, the best memory foam mattress you've ever seen, with a clean sheet on it. It's been spread taut over it, and the universe beckoning us, this divine sacred universe saying, fall into me, fall into me. Make no apologies for breathing. Make no apologies for being alive. I want you here. Let me see your fucking imprint. Let me feel you. Don't be afraid to hurt me. Let me feel your weight. Let me feel you. Yes. 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 I think this is our greatest invitation, and probably the greatest risk we will ever make, as you were saying earlier, not to play it small, not to play it small. I believe it was Oscar Maynard who said from the concentration camps a century ago to his daughter, he wrote a letter and said, sweet love, don't play it small. The world depends on your greatness. Can you imagine a dad writing this to his daughter? He never knows if he will see her again. I think of my own daughter, Sweet love, sweet Tyler, sweet Derek, Tendersong. Don't play it small. The world depends on your greatness. This is why you are here, learning and discerning, repatterning, becoming aware of yourself, becoming aware and loving in the midst of it. This is what, when we can do this, we can move through that quantum timeline. We can move to our descendants and offer that love up the line, places we're not even there yet. And we do that also by loving ourselves. And then in that quantum way, in that place where everything still is, going back and saying to our ancestors who in that time, that space where time isn't, who are asking some of the same questions we are asking and surely asked in their day, and we can give them the love and grace that we're awakening into now. And even those who are brutal, I carry the moniker of Washington, and sometimes I see the flag and I weep because I see all the broken treaties. I see all the way power has been used in this world. And it's hard for me sometimes to look with pride. I don't look with pride oftentimes. I try to look with more gratitude these days. But if we can look back, and if I can even look back to my ancestors who broke treaties, even myself, my dad who broke commitments and manipulated people, my granddad who was violent, and then all the people in the past, and see their essential selves, a purity of love somewhere within them that may have only expressed itself through the fears they were engaging and the choices they made in that day. And I have to look and say, God, maybe I would have made those same choices, as awful as they were. I may have made those same choices. So I send them back love in that quantum timeline to heal the generations, that ancestral healing, and saying, Granddad, great, 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 great Uncle George Washington, and back and back, and send them, find and believe that they have a pure love in them, and speak to that, and then even say and receive their blessing to say, how would your love like to be expressed today? That pure love that might not have shown in the ways that you wanted it to show then. How might it come and be expressed in this Washington? How might it come and be expressed in this Tyler? As we look back to our ancestors, and we become those quantum, a kind of a conduit for a healing and that collective. And I need that kind of community in my life. And we're so individualized today that, and living, as Charles Eisenstein says, these stories of separation. I want to invite the community of myself, my masculine and feminine. I want to invite my ancestors. Both my mom and dad are dead now. And I want to invite my ancestors in this collective and call in the creatures that aren't in flesh and blood, the cosmos, spirit, so that we can birth in this new culture that is so fucking glad to be alive. That I heard Charles Eisenstein say not too long ago that, was it 75% of 18 to 24-year-olds had seriously contemplated the idea of taking themselves out. Maybe this was 3 or 4 years ago he said this, but I believe life can be glad to be alive. And my own empathy goes out because I've had times when I haven't wanted to be alive. And I believe that can change, and that's what I want to be about the rest of my days, and that's what I want to invest in.
Thank you. Thank you for reaching for those dreams that bring the tears, those blessed tears of dreaming for something better, more loving, more human, more connected. As we bounce all those quantum lasers of rediscovering ourselves and our greatness at each other, at our ancestors, at all our relations.
Yeah.
And thanks for diving back into this endless conversation in this place at this time, in this moment, in this medium, to pick it back up, kick the old ball around, write a few more lines in that operating manual of how to be.
Yeah. It's so good to be with you, Tyler, and it was great to talk with you yesterday, and I'm so glad the contact was remade, and it stoked me, just your astuteness, your openness, your invitation. It really met where I was at and where I'm at right now, and I like that. I'm really glad.
Well, closing with my own gladness and my own just tender heart. Thank you. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for dreaming. Showing me your tears, your vulnerability, your excitement, your grief.
Yeah. Well, may all who might hear this have some sense of a beauty beyond themselves. May they have a sense of their own beauty. Beauty knows beauty. May we be aware of forces that are bent for good, for beneficence, and a supreme belovedness that is somehow chosen to express itself in skin and toenail right now, in us, in our species, and in the many other ways that we gasp at beauty. May all the relationships we find ourselves in be contributors to this very aliveness and beauty. And may we use our own sense of aliveness within these relationships to be gauges as to the direction we're going. And may they become compass points on our hearts in the direction that we go and are to go. May we discover ways to investigate and invite our shadows. And as we have grace for ourselves, may we have expanded grace for each other as shadows come near. And as we attempt to live together and to love together and to die together. May it be so.
And the record keeps on spinning. The story keeps on being told. The conversation goes on and on. Thank you for dropping into this one here and now. If you have any questions or comments, send them over to lumbertronic@gmail.com. And as always, keep sharing your story.